we have clients who've been coming in for years at this point. The shop's been around for 10 years. So we see some repeat people that we've been seeing for a while, and in the past couple of years, a lot more younger folks have been coming in. So people that are college age, in their 20s, are becoming interested in vintage and kind of secondhand as a whole. So we're seeing a lot more like younger people than we used to, and a lot more younger people that are maybe a little bit less, like the weird kids. Because we always got, kind of the artsy, interesting, younger kids that wanted to wear vintage and be a little bit more self-expressive. And now it's kind of a little bit of everybody. People who are maybe pay a little bit more attention to trends, but want to find some of those pieces secondhand rather than buying them new. So it's been a little bit of an interesting shift the past couple of years.
And what do you think is bringing that shift on?
I think the younger generations are definitely feeling like the eco-anxiety a little bit more than maybe some of the older generations. I think they're a lot more in tune with the idea of sustainability and the idea of secondhand shopping being better for the planet than buying things that are new. And I think being a little bit more interesting and taking more risks with your clothing is maybe more acceptable than it used to be maybe when I was in high school and things were more trend focused. Like, there are still trends, but I think younger people seem to be okay with sort of using those trends to suit themselves as opposed to trying to insert themselves into the trend, like, making themselves work for the trend.
Can you tell us about your own approach to clothing and a bit about your, formal training that you've had in the space?
Yeah. I wear a lot of vintage, obviously, and I wear a lot of handmade clothing, and things that I've altered or embellished. I love a good jacket. I love embellishing the back of a jacket. I have multiple jackets with embroidery and patchwork on the back. Right now I'm wearing a dress that I made. This was my wedding dress. And I intentionally made a wedding dress that I could wear again because I was not into the idea of having a white floofy dress that I wore once. It seems very wasteful to me. Yeah, a lot of vintage, a lot of handmade things. I kind of started sewing my own clothing in part because as a sort of more busty person compared to the size of my waist, finding clothes in a shop was always kind of a headache. So when you sew for yourself, you can make those adjustments to make your clothes fit you well, which is it feels so much better, and it's so much more empowering than going into a store and putting on a bunch of things that don't fit you well and sort of just make you feel bad.
So the shopping experience for new is no fun for you?
It's no fun, no. I've kind of always disliked shopping for new clothing. It doesn't fit well, it doesn't feel good. Dressing rooms are terrible places with poor lighting. The experience of shopping new is just not interesting. It's very impersonal too. I think when you make your own clothes, you have a much deeper connection with them because you made it with your hands, and it's more interesting to me than something that you buy that, how are you forming a connection with something that's new that you can look on the rack and there's 30 of them? It just, to me, doesn't seem very interesting or special. So I started sewing when I was a child, just hand sewing, very simple, basic kind of stuff. And then I went to college at Massachusetts College of Art and Design, where I studied fashion and fibers. I actually went to Mass Art twice. I got my BFA in fibers and then later did a certificate in fashion design. And one of the reasons that I got my fashion design certificate was that I wanted to kind of beef up my skills in terms of pattern drafting and things like that. Because I love handmade clothes. I love one-of-a-kind clothes. So yeah. And then from there, I have the vintage shop. I do repairs on our vintage, the invisible kind of repairs, and then I also do visible mending. And I just released my first little mini collection of visibly mended vintage that I'm really excited about.
That's great. So obviously you'd be doing a bit of mending in the shop as well. Do you find you're educating people through that work? And also you're teaching in the local library. Tell us about that.
Yeah. When I mend in the shop, I do it sometimes on weekends because there's a lot more foot traffic on the weekend, a lot of people coming through the shop, and it's harder to do some of the other projects that I have to do as part of my job. But when I'm sewing on buttons, always buttons, just clothing, always missing buttons. So I can just sit and stitch on buttons and engage with people and talk to them, and people see that I'm taking the time to sew on buttons, and sometimes they ask me about it, and I can tell them about some of the other mending that I do for the shop, and I think that's it. It sort of establishes a value that you don't necessarily get at a thrift store, because we're taking the time to reattach buttons and tighten up seams and take a really good hard look over all of our clothing to make sure that everything that we're putting out on our racks is really high quality and in good shape and is going to continue to last and be worn for a long time. And I also teach mending at the Cambridge Public Library. And it's just a very kind of simple hand mending techniques. I started in January, so we're coming up on my 6th workshop. I've been doing different themes for each hour and a half workshop. And it's 10 people in person and 30 people on Zoom, which is a lot. But people are really enthusiastic. People really want to learn about mending. They really want to acquire those skills for themselves and to feel empowered to fix a hem when it drops, or fix a seam when they notice it's popping open, or embellish their clothing, visible mend. I taught a darning class. People are really excited about doing some visible darning and needle weaving type of stuff. So I think there is a growing appetite for people to learn the skills of sewing, and realizing that they're a life skill and not like a specialized skill, which I think is great.
And what about the well-being aspects of the process itself? So it's great to see that that returning interest in doing it, but I mean, part of it is rescuing the items, but there's another part that is sort of more personal than that, the personal benefits of it. Could you give us your perspective on that?
Yeah. I think it kind of in the same way I was talking about, buying something new in a shop doesn't really feel like, for me, that I'm like engaging with a garment or making a connection with a garment. I think mending establishes that connection. It's hands-on in a way that makes you feel very connected to your clothing, to want to make it last. I find when I'm mending something, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember, doing this in this piece of clothing, or this place that I took it. I have a jean jacket that I have mended at the pockets because, I put my hands in the pockets and they tear, and I've mended it a couple times. And, remembering like, oh, I wore this in Istanbul 5 years ago, or I took this to Spain on a trip. I have a dress that it's like my favorite summer dress that I've mended multiple times. That's also been on multiple trips and to different places. So, mending it just strengthens that connection. And just the act of stitching, I think, is very calming and makes you feel like you're accomplishing something, as opposed to, spending 10 minutes looking at Instagram. As much as I love spending 10 minutes looking at Instagram, I could spend 10 minutes and, make my favorite socks wearable again. And that feels like you've done something instead of sort of just like zoned out for 10 minutes.
So is it part of your everyday then? Um,
Yeah, I probably mend something almost every day between my own clothing and the shop. There's always a mending pile for the shop. So, um, I probably sew on a button almost every day.
mm,
But yeah, and it's just very second nature to me now. Like, picking up the needle and being like, oh, I can do that really, really fast. Or I've even had people in the shop be like, oh, like, do you have a safety pin? Like, my button fell off. And I'm like, just give me your shirt. I'll just, like, sew it back on for you. And they're like, oh my God, really? There was a woman with a coat that she loved, and the seam was, like, splitting along the underarm. And she was like, oh, what can I do? I'm really worried about it getting worse. And I was like, well, give it to me, and I'll just do, like, a really quick, just, like, put it back together. But here's how you do it when you want to get home and do it better. Here's how to do a ladder stitch and fix it properly. But I'm just going to do a really quick fix for you. And she was so grateful, and I hope she went home and fixed her coat for good.
that's great. And just returning to the process of sewing, and probably thinking about making a garment, how does that make you feel and give you a sense of accomplishment?
I I wake up in the morning like thinking about sewing sometimes. So it's really satisfying to envision something and then sort of try to put it into practical, like 3D life, try to figure out how it will actually work and then put it together. It's like a really fun puzzle, and it does feel very accomplished when you're done. So I woke up recently and was like, I'm gonna make a patchwork dress out of men's shirts. And I like that day like went to the thrift store and I bought some secondhand shirts. And I thought it would be really quick, which is not smart. It's taking much longer than I thought. So, I had the vision in my head, and now I'm in the process of kind of figuring out, like, okay, like, how does that actually work in practical terms? And the anticipation of being like, I really want to wear this garment. That's all I want to work on because I want to wear it because I'm excited about what it's going to look like, and I'm excited about how it's going to make me feel, and to just see that finished object and to know that, like, I made it with my hands. It's very, I don't know, it feels very good. I just always feel the most myself when I'm sewing something, which is maybe cheesy, but it's true.
So there's time and there's
Yeah.
skills. Not everyone has that.
Yeah.
And so, what ideas do you have of other ways that people can help reduce the textile waste problem, and perhaps what industry can do?
Yeah. I think people on an individual level, shopping secondhand is always great. Again, that also takes time, and is not always accessible for everybody. But there are some really great like resellers out there that are kind of doing some of that work of going to the thrift stores and pulling out those really good pieces. That resellers that cater to different things. So whether it's exclusively plus size, or exclusively a specific era, or it doesn't even have to be vintage, just secondhand. If you don't necessarily have time to go out thrifting yourself, engaging with some of these sellers on online platforms, you can still shop secondhand and shop a curated selection of secondhand. So it's going to take less time to find that perfect thing that you're looking for. And yeah, shopping with like local designers. I know a bunch of people locally who have their own little small brands, and they're great people to support. There are people doing really cool stuff with dead stock fabrics and with upcycling and things like that. And then sort of on a larger level, I do believe that legislation is needed to try to get companies to kind of do the right thing. I don't think they're going to do the right thing on their own because it costs too much money. Or it will cost them, their bottom line. So legislation around workers' rights and around waste and environmental concerns and things like that. Like France, you know, making legislation that you can't just like burn your overstock. I mean, I think those are good first steps. But I don't know, it's frightening to think about. It seems like it's going to take a lot to kind of get the runaway horse and wagon like under control.
But it starts with individuals doing things differently, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, and realizing that you can't go buy just like a ton of new stuff. Like the idea of the haul is like so horrifying. and I think that goes not just for new stuff, but for secondhand things as well. There is a little bit of concern about, you know, shopping secondhand is trendier now and shopping vintage is trendy, but it still doesn't mean just because it's maybe slightly more environmentally friendly that you can still overconsume in the same way. You still kind of should only use what you need and not go and buy a whole bunch of garments that you're never going to wear. So trying to think about that differently, think about what's in your wardrobe, what you really need versus maybe what you want, or, you know, taking a step back and being like, okay, why do I want that thing? And am I going to wear it? Am I going to get multiple wears out of it? Am I going to really feel connected to it and take care of it? And if you can't say yes to that, maybe you shouldn't buy it.